some of the content in Four Lions is the sort of thing that the YouTube algorithm really doesn't like to promote. When I say some of the content, it's basically the entire movie. This is a bruising comedy about four young Muslim men who are plotting an attack against the public of London. I'm going to be circumspect in this review about the plot, but the movie definitely is not circumspect. If you want to know what it's about, just Google it. You'll get the picture pretty quickly. This is a British film, and one of the first and foremost ironies of the movie is that these guys are proud Muslims, but also they're proper blokes. Of course, it's not too outlandish that someone could be both, but the movie really plays on this incongruity for comedic value. For instance, it opens up with the guys filming a video, a manifesto video. It's got grainy footage filmed on a camera that you hold like this. The backdrop looks just a certain way. You've seen these videos in the 2000s and the 2010s. It's a certain underground aesthetic. And we see, at first, through the lens of this little camera like this, and then we cut to another angle where you get a bit of the behind the scenes. You reveal who are these people and where are they? It turns out that this rugged underground backdrop, this bunker, is actually a basement in Sheffield. We see these guys make manifesto videos a bunch of times in the movie. It's maybe one of their main pastimes, but they can never quite get it right. They always stumble into farce or into something that is a little bit revealing. Four Lions is clearly working in politically charged territory, and we'll talk about that shortly, but mainly this is a comedy. There are a number of potentially decisive narrative or didactic moments that take a sharp left turn into farce, and the result is a funny movie, I think, but maybe you're going to have some questions about what to make of it. Is this a poignant film about ideological life, about assimilation and brotherhood, or did Chris Morris just pick the subject because it would be incendiary and controversial? Well, I happen to be a big fan of Chris Morris, and I think his backstory is somewhat telling. Morris is not a Muslim. Instead, he has a background in radio. But his first big TV show was a thing called The Day Today, and it was a satire of the news. You've probably seen a clip of this at some point, actually, maybe without even realizing what it was. Of course, this show involved a lot of political topics because the news tends to do that, but political satire and satire of the news aren't quite the same thing. Actually, this hints a little bit at the way Four Lions is put together. You might expect it to be an ideological movie, and in some ways it is, but it's maybe not engaging with the ideology itself so much as everything around it. Just like this satire of the news is kind of more about not so much about the events, but kind of about how they propagate in the world and how they're received, things like that. The Day Today has a sketch about exploding dogs that presages Four Lions, perhaps. Chris Morris's next hit was something called Jam. This was originally a radio program called Blue Jam, which combined cool music with some really twisted sketches. It was adapted into a TV show which ran on Channel 4, and this probably the wackest thing ever to be broadcast on television. I cannot recommend it highly enough, though. One of the signatures of Jam is discomfort. A lot of the sketches touch on taboo subjects. For instance, there's a sketch about an acupuncturist who crucifies her clients. It's a bit hard to watch. There's a sketch about competitive parents that sabotage the other kids at the school. For instance, they get one of them drunk. This taboo fascination and aesthetic of discomfort is something that is woven deeply into Four Lions as well. Chris Morris's style is a bit like watching a car wreck, but it's a funny car wreck. There's an interesting sort of conflict when something is disturbing but also amusing. In some ways, I think both of those dimensions can be heightened when they occur together. When you laugh at something you shouldn't laugh at, is it sort of funnier in some ways? And when you laugh at something that's disturbing, or when you're disturbed by something you're laughing at, is that maybe more disturbing? These things together are stronger, perhaps. The last thing to take from Jam is that, well, maybe it's the music, maybe it's the graveness of the subject, but the show is somehow strangely poignant. And I think there's some of that here, too. Of course, these TV shows were based around sketches, short snippets, right? How do you make that kind of thing into a full movie? Well, there are a number of scenes in Four Lions that really are sketches. I think they probably were originally conceptualized as sketches, and then Morris realized he could stick them into this movie. There's a lot of pieces that are more or less standalone, but there are also some things that bring the movie together. For instance, it follows the same four guys throughout. Three of them are loutish, but the fourth one, Omar, played by Riz Ahmed, gives us something that basically none of Morris's sketches have, which is a sympathetic character that you can actually root for and that you can get attached to. Yes, he still wants to make a bang, but it adds sympathy to the mix. Now, at first, I was a little unsure how this was going to fit. When you first see that Omar has a wife and a child, you see that he's a nice family man, you might think, what's this guy doing in this movie? You might wonder, why does he hang out with these other three guys? It is a little incongruous, but the movie would not work without Omar. I don't think you could stand a feature film just about the other three guys, for one thing. He's a reprieve, but you also do get genuinely attached to him. Riz Ahmed gives a charismatic performance, and the film ends up being fairly poignant and emotional. Let's talk a little bit about the politics, though. I think it's sort of inevitable when watching this movie that you're going to try to figure out whose side it's on or what the movie is saying, at least at first. There are so many left turns, though, and there's so many moments that are played for comedy that it becomes basically impossible to keep score. Chris Morris has the satirical instinct. He is always finding the other side or the underside of things, always subverting. But I don't think that gives rise to a particularly coherent message. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is a panel discussion. It seems like it's at a university, maybe. One of the characters, Barry, who is probably the most loutish of the bunch, is on this panel, along with some scholars. It's an intricate scene, and I'm not going to try and recount the whole thing, just go watch the movie. But the thing that sticks out to me is just how many reversals there are in one scene. At first, one of the other people on the panel is talking, making some point, and Barry interrupts him to make a bold point. Oh, you think we're all such and such, he says, right? He contradicts him. But then he follows it up with a point that doesn't really make sense at all and actually sort of contradicts exactly what he was saying. And then he contradicts himself again and again. Then a guy stands up in the audience and things switch again. Important to stay hydrated. This scene reminds me of some of the discussions of identity politics that I witnessed when I was in college. And I think it's a great satire of a certain type of communication and a certain type of thought, but it makes your head spin a little bit, and it doesn't spin a little bit, and it doesn't really put forward its own coherent idea about the subject. Let's talk about a couple more specific things. First is the use of silence and language. Silence does a lot of work in this movie, a lot of work. The comedic timing in Four Lions usually involves the characters taking a beat. Someone will say something a bit unhinged, and everyone will sort of look at him. Of course, this happens in real life. People look mystified all the time. But here, I think the silence helps signal the audience. It's almost like a laugh track. The silence is almost like a laugh track. When it comes to language, I'm still a little bit sick. When it comes to language, there is a sequence in this movie where the boys go to Pakistan. It's somewhat interesting, by the way, that these characters are from Pakistan, 3 of them, I think, at least. But I'll leave that for somebody else to think and compare. In the scenes in Pakistan, which were filmed in India, actually, there is a lot of dialogue that you probably won't be able to understand. I don't want to assume, but let me put it this way. I couldn't tell what was going on. I think it's Urdu that they're speaking. Don't bother with the subtitles because they don't cover this part of the movie. And there's actually some Urdu throughout the film, which is probably a good thing. Having languages other than English in movies is usually a sign of legitimacy. But since there's no subtitles, the language has to be used sort of in a particular way. It's usually used along some kind of pantomime. Like in Pakistan, one of the lads sets up his prayer mat in the wrong direction. He's used to praying to the east, but now Mecca is in the west. This joke is constructed in a way that you really don't need to know what is being said when they explain it to him, when they sort of point, no, this way, that way. They make it, oh, you flew in an airplane. There's enough gesticulation that the dialogue is more or less irrelevant. I think they get the balance more or less right with the languages, and we get a movie that feels fairly authentic in terms of jargon and language, just the way people talk. But if you look closely, you can see that it's kind of a trick. Another mechanic that is a bit conspicuous is the use of childish metaphors. For instance, Omar tells his son the story of Simba, but it's not quite what's in The Lion King that you and I know, and it's pretty obvious that he's using this story to explain his own plans and motivations, which ends up being about as vexing as you might expect. There is a later scene with a water gun fight that has some somewhat obvious metaphorical content, perhaps. I thought both of these scenes were slightly facile, but there's maybe a more general theme of childishness in the movie, too. Omar and the boys, in a lot of ways, seem like kids. Well, maybe like middle schoolers. And this is one place where the movie is maybe hinting at something a little more poignant. One of the central metaphors in the film compares life to waiting in line at an amusement park, Alton Towers to be precise, and the end of life, the thing that they're planning, they compare that to going on the ride. Rubber Dinghy Rapids is the ride they mention, and it sort of becomes a calling card for their plan, Rubber Dinghy Rapids. There's a few things going on here. There's an implication about the mainstream middle-class life. Living in Sheffield is like waiting in line. There is some class politics that sneak into this movie. Waiting in a queue, maybe I should have said. There's a sense of personal fulfillment and ambition, wanting something better, which is interesting. Is that the cause for a martyr exactly? I'm not sure. There's also something about the value of a metaphor itself. I mean, how do you convince yourself to do this kind of thing? These are powerful aphorisms, right? Powerful ideas. And like I said, there's a way in which this whole thing is a bit childish, even as it is also one of the most mature things that there is. Like I said, this movie hints at the throes of ideological life. I don't think it has a particularly sharp conclusion about this, but a lot of the usual suspects are here. Disillusionment, a sense of purpose. Omar has an acquaintance, a brother-in-law, maybe something like that, who is a religious scholar of sorts. He doesn't really see eye to eye with Omar, but there's a beautiful scene where Omar almost confides in him, and he says, no, you're making the face already. You're already making the face. And yes, it seems like he is already making the scholar face. He has already stepped up onto the higher ground. But you also just wish that they could talk to each other, because it seems like their struggles might not be so different. And like there is something there, you know. Omar really is driven. He's really in the throes of this. Like I said, I don't think there's a big claim about ideological life here. It's not too moralistic, but it's a compelling portrait. Overall, I liked Four Lions. There are a few things that could be slightly better. Like, I think the ending is a little bit drawn out. They reuse this switcheroo joke or mechanic a few times. The movie's not perfect. It's not an incredibly deep movie. This is not one of my deepest reviews by any means, but I think the movie is pretty impressive. There are a lot of jokes in this movie. It's pretty tightly constructed. It's pretty clever, and I think it is meaningful in some ways. You might be offended by Four Lions, possibly rightly so, but it gets a thumbs up to me, and I continue to be a big, big fan of Chris Morris.